Hello. In an earlier mini-lecture, I offered a basic overview of the political pattern of relationships that emerged in Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire that is often known as feudalism. In this very brief lecture, I'd like to shift our attention from the elites of European society, those who would claim the right to carry the sword and enjoyed privilegium, or privileges, which from the Latin means private law, the right to make the laws in their own lands. I want to shift away from that group and focus now instead on the economic foundation that made all of that possible, what historians call Manoralism. This is the world of the manor, that is the central house where the lord, the knight who fits in the feudal system, has his residence. But manoralism is not really about the aristocracy. It's not about people of privilege, not about people who carry the sword. Manoralism is about agriculture. It's about peasants. It's about making the land productive, because no matter how powerful you might be as a local lord or a mafia boss, or however you want to think of that coercive authority in feudalism, you still need to eat. You still need to figure out a way of making the land productive and producing enough food that you can survive the winter and have seed corn left over to plant the following spring. And that reality, a very basic fundamental reality of life, is known in Europe as manoralism. As you'll see from the outline that's posted in the book associated with this Moodle unit, manoralism has a geographical component in which the manor house, which is the political center of the village, and the church, which is the religious center of the village, both occupy a prominent place. In some ways, the church seeks to have a symbolic presence that's bigger than the manor house. Its steeple looms above the horizon, so that as the peasants are working in the field and they look back to the village, it's the church that they see. It's the church that is present in their daily lives in a direct and visible way. And yet the manor house is never far distant either. Surrounding the cluster of residences in a medieval village are fields, typically divided into three distinct plots, with one always understood to be devoted to spring planting, that crops you harvest in the fall, another field devoted to fall planting for crops that then become ready to harvest in May or June, and one field that is left fallow, that is not planted at all. And by the 12th and 13th century, there had already emerged a pattern of crop rotation, so that each year these fields would shift in their function as a kind of basic way of keeping the ground rich enough to keep producing. Letting the ground go fallow was a crucial part of medieval agriculture. You might notice too that in the images that the ground is divided into many, many narrow strips, which meant that each villager had the right to plant on a portion of land in each of the three fields, so that no one had a majority of land in any of the three fields. At the heart of manoralism in terms of political arrangements is the relationship between the lord and the peasant, or the lord and the serf. It's a very simple, very basic relationship in which the lord is obliged to give the peasant or the serf protection in times of crisis or in times of war. All of the peasants would run to the manor house, and there in the center of the manor house was a hold or a keep, sometimes called a dungeon, that was the last holdout. It was the place that you would go to for retreat to find protection. We think of dungeons today as jails, but originally they were intended to be a point of defense. The Lord is also obliged to provide land to the peasants so that they have something to survive for their families, but then also they in turn have obligations to the Lord, among them an obligation for labor. Peasants are obliged to work the land that is owned by the Lord. Some of that land is set apart as the Lord's. All of it belongs ultimately to the Lord, but some of it is particularly for the upkeep of his family. Some of it belongs to the church, which the peasants are also obliged to make productive. And some of it they can keep the produce for themselves. So they're obliged to provide labor. They're obliged to provide obedience. So they live under the private law of their Lord. And there are also times when they are forced to make money payments. The wedding of the Lord's children. There may be a war against the Turks in which a special tax is raised. So peasants are understood to be obliged to pay whatever the Lord demands. But of course it's never in the Lord's interest to demand more than what the peasants can pay, because he wants to keep the land productive. So it is a kind of balance that tries to find its way in this relationship. We shouldn't think, by the way, of peasants as slaves. If the Lord transferred the land to somebody else, the serfs went with it, the peasants went with it. So a peasant is tied to the soil. A peasant is not free to just pick up and move wherever he or she wants. But the peasant could not be removed from the land and sold in an open market. So a peasant isn't really a slave, but is obliged to live under a host of these quite restrictive circumstances. I want to say just a few words now about the mentality of this time period, because in many ways the worldview of a peasant, 90% of Europe at the time we're talking about would fit into this category, captures what we often call pre-modern understandings of reality. And I want to just describe those quite briefly. Life for a medieval peasant, in the first place, would have been, you could call it unitary. Today, or in modern society, our lives are fragmented into distinct components. So we go to work, we go to church, we might have a bowling league that you're a part of with a different set of friends. We go on vacation with a different set of friends. We have different components of our lives that are compartmentalized. That would have been unthinkable for a medieval peasant. There is life that is religious life, economic life, political life, social life. All of the components that make up a meaningful life are interwoven into each other. And so the religious, everyone in the village goes to the same church, for example. All of the villagers plant at the same time. Villages are usually not more than 150, maybe 200, at the most 500 people, which means that everybody knows each other. There are no secrets for long in a medieval village. Life is integrated in that sense. I often find myself thinking about the Amish communities as a good parallel to describe life in a medieval village. It is a local identity. Most medieval villagers were never in crowds larger than what would be in a marketplace, maybe never in a crowd larger than 100 people in their entire life. Imagine how differently that would shape your understanding of the world. I mean, we routinely, well, maybe not routinely, but we are not surprised to hear of crowds at the University of Michigan of 105,000 people crammed into a stadium. People go to rock concerts of 40 or 50,000 people. We're used to thinking in terms of masses. Village culture in Europe was very, very local. People knew each other. It was intensely religious. I don't think you can overstress this point. You might think that I'm giving way too much attention to religion in a course that really is about European history. And yet European history, in the time period that we're talking about, was an intensely religious society. In fact, it was impossible not to think of the world apart from religion. And that meant that the church was present in every aspect of life. Virtually every day on the calendar was devoted to a saint. Every person had the name of a saint, and so to celebrate a birthday was to honor a saint. The rhythms of the year were focused on the church, so that when it's time to plant, the village priest leads the village in a procession or through the fields. In the fall, when it's time to harvest, the church is there to give thanks to God for the harvest, also to collect its tithe. The church is present at birth, at confirmation. The church is there at marriage. The church is there for the village priest is there to hear confession. And of course the church is there at death as well, that other momentous event in the life of any community, what happens to us after we die, in a way that is very difficult for modern people to imagine. The religious reality of a peasant's life is present everywhere. It was also, and I'll bring this to an end here, a hierarchical society, in a way, again, that modern people would find offensive or difficult to imagine. That is to say, in a context where order could not be assumed, in a setting where political order is contested, economic order is always unsure, the ideal world for a medieval mentality was an orderly world. And this goes back to their understanding again of religion. God is a God of order, and wherever there is chaos, wherever there is disorder, God is not fully present. And so it is evidence of God's love, God's gift, God's presence, where there is order. And that order is expressed in several different ways. It's very hierarchical. We saw it already in the church, in which the Pope is at the top of this pyramid of authority, working its way down through the cardinals and the archbishops and the bishops and the priests. But it's also there in feudalism, with the emperor theoretically at the top of the feudal chain, and then kings, and underneath the kings, viceroys and counts and dukes and palatines, and all the way down to the local lord of the manor. It's also present, ideally, in the household, in which the husband is the head, with the wife and the children and the dog coming somewhere in that mix as well. All of these characteristics we often describe collectively as being pre-modern, because as modern people we recognize that our world looks quite different. And at the heart really of our story, an important part of our story, is the question is, how did this change? How did we move from this kind of a mentality, a local world, unitary, religious, hierarchical, static? The idea was that you're born into a status, you don't change your social status, you are who you are, and your job is to find your place in that. How did all that change into the world that we know today? Crucial in that story is going to be the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and then the French Revolution, all themes that we will cover in later chapters.